Hi friends, it's Belinda here from BMakingJoy. Let's talk about tension or gauge swatching in knitting. The terms tension or gauge are interchangeable, and as Canadians we tend to freely use both. This refers to how many stitches per inch you knit with the particular yarn you are using and with the needle size you have chosen. Some people are tight knitters and some are loose knitters, so you won't necessarily have the same tension as the pattern writer does. Also, different pattern writers may have different gauges. Your pattern writer should have put the gauge on the pattern somewhere near the front page, near the materials and sizes section. And they will write it in terms of stitches times rows equals 4-inch square. Now, if your count is off by 1 stitch, it might make your finished project off by 1 inch or 5 inches, depending on the patterns. Not such a big deal if you're knitting with my June bug or lightning bugs wrap. It just makes your project wider or narrower. But if you're making a t-shirt or a sweater, a stitch count really matters. So take the time to check your gauge. This pattern is asking us to choose the needle size that we require for our particular tension to get 18 stitches and 24 rows in a 4-inch square. So with the suggested needles, knit a swatch and start counting your stitches. So I would cast on slightly more stitches than this gauge stitch requires, and we will measure stitches in the middle because the stitches on your edge may be tighter or looser than your average knitting. Then you'll work in stockinette stitches until you're gone slightly more than 4 inches. Now, I recommend using a hard ruler, not a measuring tape, because measuring tapes tend to stretch out over time. And the ruler is easier to hold still while you're counting. Now, notice that each individual stitch looks like a V. Then you want to start your count at the edge of a V and start counting across 4 inches. Jot that number down and try it again in a couple of spots to make sure that your count is the same. For measuring the rows, again, you want to start at the bottom of the V and start counting up the row, up the column, for how many rows got you 4 inches. Now worry most about your stitch count because this is where you need to be the most accurate. The width of your garment is where you want the best fit. So measure this a few times in a few different spots. Now what if your stitch count is off? Well, try again with a different needle size. For example, if you had fewer stitches than required, you're going to need a smaller needle size so that you get more stitches per inch. If you had more stitches than required, you're going to need a bigger needle size to get bigger stitches so that you have fewer stitches per inch. It's a good idea to wash your swatches before you start knitting because you want to get an idea of how much stretch there's going to be, whether any dye is going to run, and how the stretch is going to change the shape of your garment. So we've soaked them for a good 10 minutes. Then we're going to pat them dry in a towel here and lay them out flat on the blocking board and let them dry, and then see how much their shape has changed afterwards. So we've washed our pieces and we squared them off and pinned them down. The reason I'm pinning them is so that the edges will dry flat. I don't want them curling back up on me. Now, if this was a finished garment and it was to be for a specific shape or size, you give it a little maneuvering and bring out your measuring tape and get it to the size that you want it to dry to. But with the finished swatches, I'm not trying to stretch it, I'm just trying to square it off. Washed, dried, unpinned, left the fabric to relax for a while, and then I checked my gauge. And this white piece still has the same gauge as it did before we started washing it, so I've already cast on for my tank top for that one. This piece started with a gauge of 24 stitches per 4 inch and now has a gauge of 23 stitches in 4 inches. So that's a 4% stretch. So at this rate, a 40-inch bust would now have 1.6 inches of stretch. So you'll need to reconsider what your project you're making with it and whether that stretch matters to you. Should you test another swatch in a smaller needle, or will you knit a smaller size? I'm going to use this one in a shawl, so I'm not worried about the 4% stretch. Thanks for watching.